The structure was kind of hard for me to figure out. I figured that there was a story to tell, but I wasn't quite sure how to structure it. I should have talked to Marvin before I even began. But ended up beginning almost cinematically in Moscow in February 2022, which I'm sure that strikes a chord with a number of people. That was the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Putin's full-scale invasion. As Beth mentioned, I worked for CNN for 3 decades. And after I left on a full-time basis, they would send me back for breaking news. And this time they called, this is now probably maybe late January, early February, they called and they said, we are convinced the US government is correct that Russia is going to invade Ukraine. So can you get to Moscow? And of course I said yes. And I think that was a very interesting moment journalistically, because that was what they refer to now as pre-buttal, like rebuttal, but pre-buttal, you probably know that term, where the US government revealed intelligence that it normally wouldn't publicly reveal. But it knew that the Russians were planning something, an invasion. And even at that point, you had the head of the CIA, Bill Burns, going to Moscow and saying to the Russians in very serious meetings, we know what you're up to, don't do it. And as John Sullivan, our ambassador, second last ambassador to Russia, said, and he talked to me, we did an interview, and he said, the Russians lied to our face. They kept saying, never, invasion, never. We will never invade. We don't invade, people invade us, the usual line. But of course they did. So I was in Moscow beginning in February and doing live shots. So that's where I begin the book. And it really was very, very interesting because there was a weird virtual quality to it. They had, it's kind of like kabuki theater. They had prepared this invasion, but of course they didn't want to say that they were invading, and yet they were justifying it. So it was, Putin on TV almost all the time, Putin on TV saying something, and it got actually even confusing for me. Did he say that? Is that live? Is that recorded? What are those people doing at the Kremlin? It was a very odd situation. So begin there, and then I go back to my story. So, personal story, Cold War, and the big events in my life. Sputnik, 1957, although I was a kid at the time, that really had an effect because that kicked off the space race. And so John F. Kennedy, the space race with the Soviet Union, Cuban Missile Crisis. I'm thinking of my childhood, it was, yes, I played sports and yes, I swam, but a lot of the events in my life at that tender age were Cuban Missile Crisis, Sputnik, etc. It was kind of odd, but I think this was one reason I got interested in Russian, because of the Cold War. And my father was a career special agent for the FBI. So there was this kind of like Nancy Drew quality that I had where I thought I should know the language of the enemy. And so my sister, I have a twin sister, my sister and I studied Russian for 4 years in high school, then went on to study at the University of Michigan. And then we did, now this is where another kind of important thing in my life, which was the United States creating the possibility, creating fellowships and funding for studying critical languages. And Russian was a critical language at that point. So my teacher in high school, even though he was a native speaker, he had grown up in Scranton, PA, the son of Russian immigrants, but he had never taught Russian, or he had just started. So he got an NDEA fellowship, which was National Defense Education Act, 1958, to study in Russia. And then Pam and I later got NDFL, National Defense Foreign Language Fellowships, to study in Leningrad. So the government, a lot of this was, I thank very much the US government for making it possible for me to do the things that I did and to get the preparation that I had. I also worked with the US Information Agency on those exhibits that went throughout the Soviet Union. Fascinating experience. You'd go for 6 months and just talk with Russians about the exhibit and whatever subject it was. I was on 2, and the most interesting was Research and Development USA, about the space program. Then we were exchange students, and we were in Leningrad State University. Oddly enough, at the time that Vladimir Putin was, we never met him. None of the Americans met him, but that's when he was a budding KGB officer getting training in the law. And then finally, so then it begins, the journalism, and that's where, I was at the White House, and then I ended up in Moscow. And there's a lot, I would say, there's some Gorby, because I did cover him, although he was before my time slightly, but I met him and things were happening in the 80s, so I would go back. But full-time, Yeltsin and Putin. And I continue to follow Putin to this day. I did work for the Voice of America, broadcasting in Russian, the VOA, which of course now is being destroyed, I believe. Not quite sure what the status of survival of VOA is at the present time, but you can follow that. Obviously, it's a footnote that we can all follow in the newspapers. And then finally, how did I physically put it together? I actually had an interesting thing, and I'll just wrap it up pretty quickly here. A friend of mine who's Irish, I wrote to him many letters from Russia when Pam and I were exchange students, and then also on these exhibits. And he kept those letters, complete with the stamps, for 50 years and gave them to me in like 2020 maybe, somewhere around there. Gave them to me, and it was a gold mine of very long descriptions about what we had gone through. And then I had some diaries, and then I had scripts for almost 10 years, as Beth pointed out. So all of those were sources. So I get into, in the book, a lot on Ukraine, a lot on the media, the Baltics, Georgia to a certain extent, post-Soviet nostalgia, one of my favorite subjects. I actually have a little section on vodka, which I thought I should put in there. And I think. And the last thing I'll say, and here I really will wrap up, I begin it myself, let's say, when I went to, well, in high school, but really when I went to Russia as an exchange student, I was 20. And I teach at Georgetown, and my students are roughly 20. So there's kind of like a bookend to this, where I talk about being in Moscow during the invasion and having to teach, and my students being able to talk live to young Russians who were facing that, bitter, shocking truth that their country was invading another country. And then I end the book with exactly that, which to me is very, very important. Where do young people go? Where do young people, not only in Ukraine, who are dying in the war, but young Russians, some of whom are dying in the war, but are definitely having their country transform in front of their eyes. So I leave it with a question, and I can say actually blame it on Putin, because he's the one who started this war. And the results of that war, I think, will be pretty devastating for quite a long time. So that's it, and I'll turn it over to Marvin.